thank you for coming to storytelling of Eva Schuster. Eva Schuster is my grandmother. She is a Holocaust survivor. That is her in the picture there, and a very young me that she's holding as well. Before I get started, I did want to share some appreciations of a few people who made it possible to make today possible. The first person I wanted to thank is Rochelle Santos, who about a year ago, she and I started collaborating on Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it has been a true pleasure to partner with her. I also know that we'll be sharing my family's story of the Holocaust, but I wanted to take a minute to also mention her grandfather, Mark Spiro, who's also a Holocaust survivor. And I just really appreciate all the technological help that Rochelle's been giving me and the way we've been collaborating to get this message out. I also wanted to thank my mom, who's on the call with us. We'll be talking about her mother today, and I know we have a short amount of time, so I'm going to keep it really brief, but I really appreciate all the support that she gives me. She's the first person I call when I experience anti-Semitism, and she also helped make sure all my dates were in the correct order of my grandmother's life. So huge thank you to you, Mom, and I'm glad you're here, and I'm excited to share Grandma's story with everyone today. I also wanted to thank Tiffany Lilly, who I approached in the summer this past year to partner with her to make more space for the Jewish community and make inclusive practices and reduce anti-Semitism in our schools. And without her help, it really wouldn't be possible to get a lot of these initiatives going. So thank you to Tiffany Lilly as well. And last but certainly not least, my principal, Jessica Mandis. Thank you so much, Jessica. I went to her a few weeks ago with this idea of sharing my grandmother's story in honor of Holocaust Remembrance Day. And her response to me was, yes, of course, but like, what if you did it more globally for our whole district? So it was really her idea to share this with the whole district. And I really appreciate the allyship there. And I'm glad to get started with everyone. Before we start sharing my grandmother's story, I just wanted us to take a few norms as we listen to some difficult parts of history, but also as we're self-reflecting and having questions ourselves. I am going to be sharing stories that include Jewish violence and genocide. So I just ask that you take care of yourself as you listen to my grandmother's story. Be mindful of your nervous system. You know, it's really hard to hear about humans treating other humans this way. So please just check in with yourself as we tell her story and make sure that you're doing okay. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself, and just be mindful. I ask that we listen with love and empathy today. This is really difficult to hear, so lean into discomfort. And at the end, I wanted to extend an invitation to everyone. After hearing the story today, I hope that at the end we can reflect together on what we've heard, and then what are our next steps to be actionable against anti-Semitism together. Before I get into Eva Schuster, the Holocaust survivor, I just wanted to introduce my family to the group. This is my family. We are, comes in all shapes and sizes, colors. We mobilize many languages. I think it's really important that when we tell Holocaust stories, that we also get to know the humans behind these stories. So when I was growing up, my grandmother Eva, I knew her as Grandma. My grandma had many wonderful things about her. One of the things that I loved most about my grandmother was she was a chocolate lover like myself. In fact, my grandmother used to, because she didn't want to share her chocolate with the rest of the grandkids as much, growing up, she would hide boxes of Kit Kats around the house, which just turned into a really fun hide and seek game for my brother and I and our two cousins, Jessie and Karen, where we would look for the Kit Kats, which, you know, joke was on her there. My grandmother is a very strong woman. When my mom and I were talking about words that would describe who she is, the word that came up the most was strong and survivor. She was a very direct woman, You always knew where you stood with my grandmother, which is something I really appreciate, and also probably one of the reasons why my preferred communication method is to be more direct. She loved her sister. Her sister is in a lot of these pictures, and we'll be talking about her sister today, Marion. They called each other Ipey and Pipey, were their nicknames for one another, and their bond was extremely special. She also really loved her husband, Irving, my mom's dad, who's in a lot of these pictures here as well. And I'll share, that's them in the middle there. The two of them were just the most complimentary people ever. My grandmother was a force to be reckoned with, and my grandfather was just the most gentle human being you could ever meet. So the two of them together were just incredible role models to grow up with. The picture on the left is a picture at my bat mitzvah. My brother, Sam, is standing all the way to the left. My grandmother, Eva, is right next to me. I'm in the middle there with much browner hair at the time. My grandfather standing next to me, and those are my cousins, Jesse and Karen. And all the way over to the right, that would be my grandmother with the boa wrapped around her. She loved to party, and she definitely didn't take for granted what life had to offer. So my grandmother grew up in Berlin, Germany. She grew up speaking German as her first language. As she grew up, she recalls in her story really hearing about the rise of Nazism around 9 years old. There's a specific moment that she remembers sitting in the living room with her father. He had a newspaper out, and on the side of the newspaper, he wrote, "When this political party comes to power, it is not going to be good for us." And that was when she first started hearing about the rise of Nazism and Hitler. In these pictures here, you can see Kristallnacht being photographed. So my grandmother's mother, Irma, was invited to attend Kristallnacht. She was on the streets in Berlin when Kristallnacht happened. For those who are unfamiliar with what Kristallnacht was called the Night of Broken Glass. That's what's being photographed here. And you can see this was the night where the Nazis started setting fire to synagogues, to Jewish residences, Jewish businesses, and they arrested around 30,000 Jewish people this night. And this was one of the first major violent acts during the Holocaust in Germany. My grandmother describes the morning after Kristallnacht when her mother was sharing what it was like being there. She said, she didn't really understand what was going on because there were all of these fires happening, storefronts were broken into. At one point, Nazi soldiers were taking coats off of Jewish people's backs and giving them to other people. And it was a very confusing time for Irma, and sharing that with my grandmother. When my grandmother went to school the next day, it was all of the students were talking about. She recalls one of her classmates turning to her and saying, like, "Did you hear what happened? All of the synagogues are burning." And her response was, "They're what?" And it just was very unbelievable to her at the time, even living in that moment, because opposingly, when she was 9, hearing her dad talk about the rise of Nazism and how that would be very bad for them, it was thought by everybody living in Berlin that Hitler and the Nazi Party wouldn't make it very far, that they wouldn't stay long, and therefore it would be okay. Obviously, that was not the case. Right before Kristallnacht happened, my grandmother's father, whose name is Richard, he ended up traveling to the United States, not because they had an inkling that it wasn't safe for them to be in Berlin, but because he wanted to go to the United States for his studies. Eventually, when he saw what was going on with his family back in Germany, he tried to come back later, but Germany wouldn't let him back in because he was Jewish. So he was actually had to stay in the United States while Irma, my grandmother, and her younger sister, Marion, were stuck in Germany. Eventually, after Kristallnacht, my grandmother, her mother Irma, and her younger sister Marion were forced out of their home. They were taken out of their home by Nazi soldiers, and they were sent to the Jewish ghetto. I've included a picture here of what a Jewish ghetto did look like in Germany at the time. This is not a picture of my grandmother, but I wanted to include it so that people could get a visual to see what conditions were like living there. In this picture, you can see it was fortified with barbed wire to keep humans in, and SS or Gestapo patrolling the borders as well. So once my grandmother Marion and her mother Irma moved to the Jewish ghetto, my grandmother shared about what that was like living there. The conditions were really terrible, and they were pulled out of their home, not given any time to pack a bag or take sentimental things. So really it was a very rushed and immediate change for them. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. My family knew that when they were living there that they needed to sew Jewish stars or Stars of David onto their clothing. This was a requirement for any Jewish person living in Germany at this time. The Jewish star would allow you or not permit you to go in certain places in Germany. It also allowed for the Gestapo and the Nazi soldiers to stop you on any street corner, on any street, to ask you questions, check to make sure that you were doing what you needed to do. So this was the experience that my grandmother had living in the Jewish ghetto. Here's a picture, again, not of my family, but I wanted everyone to have the visual of what it looked like. Those were the stars of David that were sewed onto everyone's clothing, and it had to be on your outermost clothing. So that's why it's on the coats and people who aren't wearing coats, their shirts. And it does say in German, Jew, but in German inside of the star. My mom and I were reviewing all of these events when we were trying to put it all together, and we were sharing about a time. There are many moments in my grandmother's story where we kind of look at each other and just say, like, I can't believe she did that. That was so risky. One of those moments is a time when my grandmother, she did not sew her star on her clothing. She would pin her star on her clothing, because when she would leave the ghetto or go to different places inside the ghetto, she would unpin the star, which would allow her into spaces where Jewish people were not allowed. And she would take this risk pretty frequently. One of the times that she did this was she snuck back to their old home throughout her time living in the Jewish ghetto. And she had unpinned her star in order to go back and take a look at it. And when she was there, you know, she said, like, it looked like nobody had been in there since they had removed her from the home. She wanted to get a few items, pictures, and things of sentimental value. And a few of these times where she would unpin her star, she eventually did get caught. And when she was caught, the Gestapo who stopped her just told her, he was like, listen, this was not a smart idea on your part. The next person who catches you will kill you. You need to sew it onto your clothing for your own sake. So my grandmother took a lot of risks like this throughout her escape story. And this is just an example of one of those times. While my grandmother was living in the Jewish ghetto, she was working for the SS, which was a branch of the Nazis at that time. When she was working for the SS, this was a very sought after position for Jewish people who are living in the ghetto because it was not physical labor. And it also was a position that did allow her to make a little bit of compensation. While she was working for the SS, she was also struggling with nourishment and food source for her and her family. So one day she ended up shaking an apple tree to try and get some food for her family. Again, she got caught doing this, and when the SS caught this act happening, they asked all of the Jewish people that were working for them at that time to make a line and line up. When they had asked everyone to line up, they did end up accusing a woman who was not my mother or my grandmother of causing this act of what they would call stealing food. And when my grandmother saw that this girl was getting accused for her actions, she went up to one of the SS soldiers that she was working with and said, you know, it was me that shook the tree. And he looked at her and he said, I know, I saw you do it. That was incredibly unintelligent of you. And she said to the SS soldier, you know, I don't want this other girl to get in trouble. It was my fault. You know, it should be me. And he told her, you know, we'll take care of it. But we know that it was you. There were many moments in my grandmother's story where she would have to take risks like this in order for her and her family to survive. And at times she would get caught and at times she wouldn't. And it's just really amazing as my family and I reflect back on her story, you know, these moments that really could have been life or death for her. So my family stayed in the Jewish ghetto for a little bit of time. Eventually, they did end up leaving because their names were coming up on a list. And what that meant for you as a Jewish person living in the ghetto is when your name comes up on that list, it meant that you're being sent to a concentration camp. So my grandmother did have a heads up that that was going to be happening for her family ahead of time. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up going to the consulate in town. So what happened was my grandmother with her mother Irma and her younger sister Marion. In this picture, Marion is the woman on the left. My grandmother is the woman on the right. And the person in the middle is my Uncle Rudy, who eventually became the husband of Marion once they came to the United States. This picture was taken after their liberation. I will show some pictures throughout the presentation of my grandmother during the Holocaust, but as I'm sure you can imagine, we don't have a ton of photographs of that time. But so when they knew that their name was coming up on the list at the Jewish ghetto, my grandmother took her mom and her sister to the consulate in the morning. They started lining up outside of the consulate at 6 a.m. They waited in line until it opened at 10 a.m., so they waited for 4 hours outside. When my grandmother tells this part of her story, she remembers that the interviewer had asked her, you know, how many Jewish people were there doing what you were doing? And she said there had to be hundreds of people lining up to this consulate trying to get legal passports and papers to leave Germany. So what happened was she and her family lined up. At 10 o'clock, they were allowed in. And what that looked like was there were hundreds of Jewish people in the consulate in lines trying to make it to the SS where they would collect your information and then what they thought would be giving you passports to leave. Now, Jewish people were not allowed to talk to the SS or the Gestapo. The Gestapo would be walking up and down the aisles in the consulate with dogs, and you were not allowed to speak to them, but there were a few representatives from the Jewish community who were there who would speak on your behalf. And as my grandmother and her family started coming up in the line, my grandmother made eyes with one of the spokespeople for the Jewish community. And he made eye contact with her and he just kind of shook his head no. And my grandmother turned to her mom and her sister and she said, they're not going to give us passports. We need to leave. And her mother asked her, we've waited in line all this time, why are we leaving? And my grandmother told her, the man shook his head no. What he means by that is they're not going to give us legal papers to leave. And if they lock the doors and leave us in here right now, it will not be safe for us. So my grandmother, her mom, and Marion ended up leaving without making it to the SS, where they were collecting names. But it also meant that they would not have legal passports to leave Germany. So my grandmother had to come up with an idea of how they were going to get some sort of passport or paper that would allow them to leave Germany. So she ended up, she knew of this postman who falsified documents, and she ended up getting this postman drunk one night. And by the end of the night, after a night of drinking alcohol, he agreed to give her the papers. And they had in their hands some falsified documents that looked like passports to leave Germany. This allowed my grandmother and her family to board a train. So Irma, my grandmother Eva, and Marion got on a train, which was leaving Germany and going to Austria. When they got on the train, immediately a Gestapo soldier and policeman came on. There were a few of them. I believe that they had dogs with them as well. And the Gestapo made a big announcement to the whole train, saying that if there are any Jews on this train trying to escape, you will be shot on sight. My grandmother was very good at thinking on her feet. Anyone who knew her also in her life post-Holocaust knows that she's very quick with a response. So her Holocaust story is no different from that. And right after this Gestapo man had made the announcement about any Jews trying to escape, you will be shot on sight, my grandmother immediately, in her very strong, my mom describes it as like almost a Prussian German accent, yelled back at the Gestapo saying, "Excuse me, sir, you are interrupting the start of my family's vacation. You are way too loud and it is ruining our vacation. You need to be quieter." And people didn't really speak like this to the Gestapo, certainly not Jewish people, because you're experiencing that trauma response whenever you're interacting with Gestapo. So they're used to Jewish people being very afraid and kind of acknowledging body language that way. And we think that my grandmother really took this Gestapo off guard, and he was very startled by the way that she yelled at him. So when he went to check her papers and Irma's papers and Marion's papers, he very quickly looked through it, handed them back, and let them sit down. So again, this was another moment where my grandmother really took one of those risks. I mean, Jewish people at that time really didn't yell at Gestapo. They would be the ones who would arrest you or kill you or send you to a concentration camp. But because she startled him so much, he really he wasn't in his right mind to check their papers and look for any falsified evidence in their passports. So we think that this allowed them to finish their train ride safely. When my grandmother and Irma and Marion did finish the train ride, they ended up going to this inn where the innkeeper was known for hiding Jewish people and disguising them as employees. So at this time, Irma, Marion, and Eva were working at the inn. My grandmother was working as, how she describes it, a chambermaid. In this picture, this is an actual photograph of my grandmother at that time. The woman with the lighter hair and what looks like a black vest over her white shirt, that is the innkeeper's wife. And the person next to her with more of like a gray toned vest and the darker hair, that's my grandmother. And she was folding laundry in this picture, but I thought it was important to include this picture because it is a photograph of the time when she was hiding at the inn, but also this woman standing next to her, who in the picture they're laughing and smiling together. She's an important part to this next part of my grandmother's story. So as they were hiding out at this inn and trying to find out where their next place that they were traveling to was, the innkeeper's wife, this woman here, she wasn't told who my grandmother was. The innkeeper didn't think that it would be a good idea to share with her that they were hiding Jewish people, because the consequence for non-Jews hiding Jewish people at this time during the Holocaust was the same as Jewish people existing. You would be arrested, you and your family could be sent to the concentration camps as well, or also killed. So he did not share that with his wife. However, she did pick up on the fact that there was some sort of secret happening between my grandmother and her husband, and because she ended up getting very jealous, and because she didn't know what that secret was, she ended up calling the Nazis and saying that there are Jews here. The innkeeper had warned my grandmother that this call had been made, that the Nazis were notified that they were hiding out at the inn, and so therefore they had to execute another evacuation plan. At this time, the innkeeper had told my grandmother, you know, the Nazis are going to be looking for Jews fleeing the inn. So what happened was Irma, her mother, and her younger sister, Marion, they ended up leaving earlier that morning. And the innkeeper told my grandmother, you know, you need to stay because they're going to be looking for fleeing Jews. And if you're somebody who rows them across the river, they won't suspect that you're the Jewish person who's hiding out here. So my grandmother ended up staying at the inn. Nazi soldiers did arrive and come to look at the inn and try and find Jewish people. When they were satisfied with looking through the inn, there was a river close by to this inn, and my grandmother did row them across the river. This part of my grandmother's story is something that she repeated to me over and over again as I was growing up. I used to hear her story in bits and pieces. It wasn't always in chronological order the way I'm telling it today, but I always heard this part of the story. My grandmother shared about the deep terror and fear and how scary it was being a young Jewish girl rowing all of these Nazi soldiers by herself, unarmed, across a river. One of the Nazi soldiers, as she was rowing them across the river, said to her, "We can smell a Jew from 1,000 miles away." My grandmother, when she tells this story to our family, has a lot of other things that she says in this moment, which, you know, there are professionals on this call, so I won't share all of those, but she does describe this moment of being extremely scary. It also was a moment which marked her getting separated from her mother and her sister, which is how the rest of her survival story ended up unfolding. She also, I think it's important to mention that my grandmother was 9 years old when she heard her father mention the rise of Nazism. When they moved to the Jewish ghetto, she was around 14 or 16, and all throughout her story, she's really a teenager and in her early 20s. So if you can just imagine being a teenager in your early 20s, knowing that you're getting hunted down because of your identity as a Jewish person, and having to manage the emotional trauma of that while also not showing that because you're rowing a group of Nazi soldiers across the river as they tell you that they can smell a Jew from 1,000 miles away. This moment really stuck out when my grandmother would share it with me growing up. I will say that she safely made it to the other side of the river. She and the Nazi soldiers did part ways. After she and the Nazi soldiers parted ways, my grandmother ended up hiking the Austrian Alps. Obviously, we didn't have internet and cell phones or maps of where she was going. So the way that my grandmother tried to figure out how to find her mother and her younger sister was she would follow the hiking trails that were in the Austrian Alps. And she did this by herself, not knowing where she was going. The climate and temperature and weather at this time was very snowy. Obviously, you can see in this picture, like this is the outfit that she had with her. She did not have hiking boots for snow. So you can just imagine what that was like. Eventually, she did make it to a town in the middle of the Austrian Alps where an English teacher she knew was hiding her mother and her sister. And she made it into the village, and she was asking around the town where this English teacher's house was so that she can try and be reunited with her family. She did get an answer, and she did find his home. And when she made it to this English teacher's house, he kind of told her, like, what were you doing asking where I was? Like, you put me in danger, you put you in danger. It's a small town here. Everybody knows where everyone lives. So if you're asking where somebody lives, you're letting people know that you're not from around here. When my grandmother arrived at this English teacher's house, she also was told that it wasn't safe for her to stay with the English teacher and her mother and her sister. It was too much of a risk to have all three of them hiding out there. But the teacher had told her that there was a nice farming family who lived a little further up in the Alps, and that she would be safe staying with them. So my grandmother ended up continuing to hike up the Austrian Alps, and then she met the Wiesels. This is a picture of the Wiesels. They are the family that hid my grandmother for 4 years in the Austrian Alps. I'll just explain who everybody is in the picture. So on the top left is Mrs. Wiesel. She was the wife of Mr. Wiesel, who is on the other side of my grandmother, in the middle there with the very impressive mustache. In the picture, my grandmother, Eva, is in between Mrs. Wiesel and Mr. Wiesel. She's dressed in the traditional Austrian clothing that they gave her, so that she would blend into her surroundings. The other 4 boys in the picture are 4 of the 6 sons that the Wiesels had. And I'll share some of the rules that my grandmother had to follow hiding here. But I also think it's really important to mention that the Wiesels had 6 children of their own, and that they risked their own life to hide my grandmother, even knowing that the consequence, if they were caught, would be that they would most likely lose their lives, as well as their 6 children's lives as well. This part of the story is really important to me because I think a lot about the anti-Semitism we're seeing now. And I know that when I'm in spaces with people sharing about their fears and barriers to standing up against anti-Semitism, is there's a fear of what would happen if you were treated like Jewish people are treated. And I always think of the Wiesels and what they were willing to sacrifice and the privileges that they put as agency just to make sure that my grandmother was able to survive. And so my family talks a lot about the Wiesels. We really appreciate them. Later, when my grandmother had made it to the United States and had her own family, my mom and her brother went back to Austria with my grandmother, and they did get to meet the Wiesels in person, all of the sons, and it was a really special moment. But getting back to our time period here, so when my grandmother stayed with the Wiesels, as I mentioned, she was there for 4 years. And as she was there were a lot of rules that she had to follow. My grandmother was not allowed out during daylight hours. The Wiesel family was a farming family, so they had a barn with hay in it and animals. And so what my grandmother would do is she would hide in the bales of hay during the day, and then at night she would come into the main house and have dinner, which usually consisted of like a big bowl of barley soup in the middle and whatever bread was made from the day, and all of them would share that, and then she would go back into the barn. The Wiesel's home was raided a few times by Nazi soldiers and searched. When it was searched, there was one time where a Nazi soldier did go into the barn and took a pitchfork and would stab the bales of hay to see if there was anyone hiding there, and pull up the floorboards to make sure no Jewish people were hiding under the floorboards in the barn. When the Nazi soldier was stabbing the bales of hay, my grandmother recalls a memory of the pitchfork missing her by about an inch and a half. So again, there are these really close call moments that my grandmother went through. This is a picture of my grandmother in between Mrs. and Mr. Wiesel there. As my grandmother hid out with the Wiesels, she also was separated for these 4 years from her mom and her little sister. And what they used to do was the churches in the towns in the Austrian Alps would send encrypted letters back and forth between all of the churches so that my grandmother could communicate with her sister and her mother. One time they would help orchestrate times where they could meet up at night, although not frequently. My brother and I were reflecting on one of these times the other day where my grandmother snuck out at night in the snow in the Alps and hiked down to see her younger sister, Marion. Marion also left her hiding place at night to find my grandmother, and both of them knew they had to make it back to their respective homes before daylight. Marion's family that was hiding her ended up giving her a pistol because they said, you know, it's really not safe for you and it's not safe for us if you get caught. So if you get caught, you have to fire this weapon. Otherwise, all of us are either going to be killed or sent to concentration camps. My Aunt Marion had never handled a gun before, didn't know how to shoot it. And as she hiked through the Alps to see my grandmother, she reached this one point where there was a shrouded figure and she couldn't make out who it was walking towards her. And as that figure got towards her, she thought like, oh my gosh, this is going to be one of those times where I'm going to have to use this weapon. And luckily my grandmother stepped into enough light before she fired the gun. But it was my grandmother who was walking towards her. And thankfully both of them made it out of that experience alive, but it was really risky to visit your family. This is Marion and Eva, my grandmother, or Ipey and Pipey as they called each other. So when was my family liberated? After spending 4 years together with the Wiesels, finally, the U.S. liberated Austria, which is where they were at the time. U.S. soldiers had German soldiers surrender, and it was the U.S. soldiers who came up into the mountains to the Wiesels and told the U.S. soldiers that they've been hiding a Jewish girl. So the Wiesels had reached out to those U.S. soldiers who were liberating people throughout the Alps. And that's how they knew where my grandmother was. My grandmother was reunited with her family and brought to Salzburg and put on a boat headed to the United States. What it felt like and what it looked like arriving in the United States. So her dad, Richard, had been in the U.S. This whole time, as he was not allowed back into Germany because he was Jewish when he left to study there. when my grandmother, Marion, and Irma arrived by boat, they arrived in the New York harbor, and my grandmother describes the experience of the boat docked, and they all came out into the harbor, and they had an alphabet, almost like in the loading dock there, where people would stand under, because you have to remember so Richard, my grandmother's dad, was coming to pick up his family, but he hadn't seen his family in almost 10 years. When he saw Marion, she was an elementary school age, and now she's a 20-year-old. So it was really hard to recognize your family members because of how much time had passed. So what they did was they stood under the first letter of your last name, and that's how people would find their families. So when Richard went over to the D, because my grandmother's maiden name is Don, and he found Marion, my grandmother, and his wife Irma, he kind of took a second look at Marion, because he was like, who is this, young woman? And my grandmother had to reintroduce her sister to her father because she was unrecognizable to him. And my grandmother tells this in her interviews for the Shoah Foundation. She kind of shares this part of the story as how she said to her dad, meet your daughter, Marion. She's 20 now. And this was when they were all reunited. When my family was reunited, before I share that, I just wanted to include the map of the escape route that my grandmother walked. They took a train out of Germany, but she hiked those Austrian Alps on foot. When my family made it to New York, they ended up living in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, which my grandmother describes as the most luxurious place she's ever lived. And I think it's important to mention that her survival story really didn't stop once she was liberated. My mom and I were sharing the other day of just like different pieces of how she relived this moment over and over as a human being. For example, there was one time once she was in New York and she found out that her friend, Peter Ritchie, who had made it out earlier because they had gone through the UK and was also living in New York, that he was around, and they were reunited, and Peter kind of looked at her and was like, Eva, I thought you were dead. And there are a lot of these moments that happened for my grandmother as she continued to live her life after the liberation. Another moment that she had was, much, much later in life. I was already born. She had lots of grandchildren, but she was walking the streets of New York City, and she had looked across the street and recognized one of the Nazi soldiers who was like one of the main generals, or somebody who arrested and killed a lot of Jewish people. And she, along with many other people, ended up reporting him, and eventually he was arrested. But there are these moments where she would have to relive her trauma over and over, even after liberation. But the one thing she always shares when she was interviewed either for the Shoah or at in the archives of the United States Holocaust Museum is people always ask her, well, what would you want to share with people that you've learned from this experience? And she always says, after experiencing this all, I learned that not all mankind is bad, and you need to hold on to hope. Hope is what helped me survive. And I also just wanted to include Elie Wiesel's words of wisdom as well, that, as Holocaust Remembrance Day happens tomorrow, I think his words of wisdom that we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented, is so important to remember. I also wanted to share, as I mentioned, my grandmother's story is in the archives at the United States Holocaust Museum. As I mentioned too, her story is many, many years worth. So unfortunately today I could only share some of some of the events that helped her escape and survive. This picture always sticks with me. It's when I visited the museum, it was the hardest room for me to walk through. But in one of the rooms, there's the Hall of Shoes. This is a picture of the Hall of Shoes. And the quote that's on the back there, I know it's probably hard to read over Zoom, but how it starts is, "We are the shoes. We are the last witnesses. We are the shoes from the grandparents and the grandchildren, and they tell the story." So these are the shoes from Holocaust victims who were gassed in gas chambers. Some of the shoes there, I don't know if they belong to some of my family members. I will share that my grandmother, her mother, Irma, Marion, and Richard are the only family members of ours who were able to escape the Holocaust. All of the rest of our family members, unfortunately, lost their lives. And so we don't have all of these family members any longer to talk to share memories of. One of my grandmother's uncles did write an encrypted letter to my family when they were living in the Jewish ghetto. Many of my family members were sent to Sachsenhausen in Warsaw. This particular uncle was at Sachsenhausen. For those who are unfamiliar with Sachsenhausen, Sachsenhausen was near Berlin. It was the concentration camp that was best known for its medical experimentation wing. And he had written a letter to my family, which took them about a week to decipher, that was describing what it was like living in the concentration camp. And he said, you know, I woke up late this morning and I went downstairs. And when I went downstairs, I realized, because I was late, that everyone was dead. And when I asked what I should do, the Nazis just sent me back upstairs. And he said, I know I survived today because I was late showing up. Unfortunately, this uncle did eventually lose his life in Sachsenhausen. But I just wanted to also, as I stop sharing my screen and open the space up for questions and answers, I just wanted us to take a minute to remember those who lost their lives during this atrocious time in history. There were 6 million Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. It didn't just happen in Germany. And it wasn't just Jewish people either who lost their lives. So I just wanted to take a minute to all those affected by the Holocaust as I unshare my screen, and we can take a minute to reflect. And when you're ready, if you're ready, I'm open to taking any questions that anybody has or any reflections. I think at this time, I know Rochelle had mentioned that we will allow you to turn your camera on. Please don't be shy. I've heard it all. And I think it's really important as we're in community together to support each other with this. So feel free to unmute as that works for you.
Thank you so much, Kim. This was like amazing. Obviously, you mentioned at the beginning of the story that my grandfather was also a Holocaust survivor. And so I really just appreciate you sharing all of the details of your grandmother's story and how fortunate you are to have these stories and to be able to have communicated with your grandmother, to hear all of these accounts so that you can share this. And I'm gonna reshare the links to my grandfather's videos to my family tonight, just to encourage them to reflect as well. I just wanted to add a couple other things, and then I'll turn it over to other folks to join. I just thought it was really interesting, and sort of the similarity in that my grandfather also was a risk taker and would leave the ghetto at night and ride his bicycle to go get food and to make trades. And it's really fascinating, right? That like what that risk taking behavior gave to them, right? And it was so risky, but it was instrumental in their survival.
No.
And the other comment that I had is just how amazing it is that your family was able to go back and meet the Wiesels in Austria. That is awesome that they were able to do that. Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you so much. I'll turn it over to other folks who want to jump in, but thank you again for sharing. I see hands raised, so just to help move things along, I couldn't call on folks. So Jen, I think I saw yours first.
Thank you. Hi, Kim. I don't know if you remember me, but one of my kids was in your class. But thank you for sharing this story. I didn't even know that your family was Jewish, but we're a Jewish family also. Never even knew it. Have you had the chance to go back, or was just your mom and your uncle?
Of course, I remember Bella. It's good to see you, Jen. Yes, so I have not been back. I would say that learning this story about my family has created a very complicated relationship for me with some of these places. I have gone through some of the places in Germany. I lived in southern France for a little while, and so I, like on the weekends and things like that, I would visit. I did visit Strasbourg. I went through Frankfurt, and I did visit Munich. I haven't been able to bring myself to Berlin yet. However, my brother and I have been talking recently about how that's something we really want to do. My uncle is still very much in touch with our chosen family of the families that hid all of us. So I know that that's an option, like when we're ready. But I have not. My mother, who's on the call, I know she said she's going to be a fly on the wall, but she did get to meet them. And I know that she and her brother have maintained contact.
That's fantastic, and thank you for sharing this story.
Of course. Thanks for coming. And please tell Bella I say hi.
I will.
I think I saw Beverly's hand next.
Hi. That was fascinating. I'm sorry that your grandmother had to go through that. I wanted to know your mother's reflections and your reflections of what's happening right now in the U.S. If that is reminiscent of what she has heard about pre-World War II Germany.
Yeah, I can absolutely answer that. Mom, just unmute if you feel comfortable, or I can answer for both of us. But I know that I have been really appreciative of the DEI department at Framingham Public Schools, who I reached out to in the summer because of my concern of the rise of anti-Semitism. Daisel, who's also on this call, has been super supportive of that work and in those spaces as well. As a granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, hearing what my family has been through, it has been extremely difficult to watch what has been going on. There's this thing we experience with holding intergenerational trauma, with receiving anti-Semitism and going through those trauma cycles with everything that's going on today, and it is very difficult. I know I've talked in other spaces a little bit too of just like how it shows up everywhere. These systems of oppression are very sneaky and clever, and they can disguise themselves in many ways, sometimes in microaggressions in the workplace, sometimes in our personal lives with drawing swastikas on temples. No amount, big or small, of act makes it any easier to receive it. And I think what has been the hardest, at least for me, I'm not sure about my mom, but the hardest for me is the recent Holocaust denial, thinking that the Holocaust didn't happen, or blaming Jewish people for the Holocaust happening. So those are just my reactions. And I know I talk to my mom a lot about it. She's the first person I call when I'm like, you'll never believe what happened. But I know she's mentioned to me her response of what it has felt like growing up with her mother and seeing it now. I see she's unmuted, so I'm going to let her speak for herself.
Yeah. I'll come off, but I didn't want to steal your show. So, but yeah, I mean, I think for me, the scariest thing is a lot of the same sort of patterns my mother talked about. And my brother and I thought, this doesn't feel realistic. And then when it started happening in the US for the first time, we kind of understood where she was coming from. And that, I think, was the scariest for me, because I always sort of dismissed it. So that's personally hit me really hard recently.
Thanks, Mom. Any other questions for us? I'm also really good with, my friends make fun of me. They say I prescribe literature like a doctor prescribes medication. So if you have any interests of books to read as an adult, specific to any kind of anti-Semitism, whether you want to celebrate Jewish joy or learn more about Jewish contributions to our society, or want to learn about the fetishizing of dead Jewish bodies over living Jewish bodies, course correction from the Jewish community centering the victim. I have all sorts of suggestions. Or if you want to hear about how I talk about it in my classroom, what kind of books for young kids I have, I'm very good with a book suggestion. I think one thing that is really impressive with the time that we are living in is that there is so much representational literature right now. And although it is very difficult for anti-Semitism right now, that these resources do exist. So if you want to reach out to me via email and that feels more comfortable, I have all of them right next to me right now. I keep looking down because they're right here, but I'm happy to share whatever helps.
So I just wanted to share that I work with Kim in her classroom this year, and I am so grateful for all the stuff that I've learned from her and how more aware I am of my surroundings and realizing like how things are so like not inclusive for the Jewish community. As this year I was trying to get her flowers and everything had either a Christmas tree or red and green colors, and I didn't want that because I know like it just represents Christmas. And so learning all this from her is amazing, and the way she teaches our students is phenomenal. And I'm so grateful to learn so much from her.
Vice versa, Ada. I'm very fortunate to have Ada in my room. I appreciate our partnership. I know it's not easy to kind of like self-reflect and acknowledge that like not all of us are experts on everything and there's room to grow. And I think Ada is just the model of, curiosity, and I want to learn more and I want to be inclusive. I've never had someone like pick out Christmas trees out of a bouquet of flowers to make it more inclusive to me. And she's also read like all of the Holocaust historical fiction books that are in my classroom library herself. So I really appreciate you, Ada, and I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
Elise, I saw your hand next.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, thank you so much. This was so exciting to hear and to hear the incredible story of your grandmother, and it was amazing. And I guess I just have a follow-up question for you. How are you handling the rise in anti-Semitism now? I'm similar to you, where I call my mom right away too, and I think I'm really struggling to share how I'm handling it if people ask me. And I'm just curious how you and your family are, dealing with it, and what, else we can do to handle what's happening with anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I super appreciate this question. And I want to say from one heart to another, like, I'm so sorry that you have to process all of that. It's the worst feeling. I think, so I'll answer in two parts. I think what's been really hard for me, I grew up, we were like one of 6 Jewish families in the town we grew up in. So I was really used to growing up with people who didn't know what being Jewish meant, who didn't, like, the school system. I don't think we had Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur off when I was there. But that was just kind of like what you could expect. So the overt anti-Semitism and the exclusion, like, it shouldn't be this way, but I was used to that because I grew up in a community where that was just the way things were. I think what's been the most difficult for me has been the silence from other people. You know, I think that that's been really tough. I think it's also been hard for me when I've had to make anti-Semitic or the perpetuation of anti-Semitism visible to people that I am in community with, and they either double down or are not at a place where they're ready to hear that they, and I always operate from a place of, I don't think anybody intentionally says or does anything to harm someone, but unfortunately, like, not all of our lenses are fine-tuned to see all the systems at play. And so it's easy for me as a Jewish person who had a Holocaust survivor as a grandmother to see all the little things at play. So when I make that visible to somebody who I've been in community with, who I thought was a friend, and they don't react well to it, I think those are the moments that I struggle with the most, because it's like, you know, I thought we had the relationship where we could have these honest conversations, and it almost feels like a betrayal. And especially when that behavior is acted on and continued on, or like, they turn it on you where they get angry with you for pointing it out, even though it's you who received the harm. Like, that's really tough. I will say things that have helped are taking social media breaks. There's a lot going on social media, and sometimes it's nice just to not look at the phone. I have an incredible family that is very supportive and knows what it feels like to go through anti-Semitism. I have really amazing friends as well who, you know, they might not be Jewish, but they also hold marginalized identities and know what it feels like to operate within a system. And we've known each other for decades, so it's been really nice that we all kind of just vent together. And also people who are just committed to understanding me and not misunderstanding me. That's really helpful. I am a person who likes to arm myself with facts and information, so I read as much Jewish history as possible. I find that learning why things are the way they are for some reason makes me feel better. So I like learning about all of the expulsion of Jews out of Spain and Portugal, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, you know, like all of those things. It helps me to put it in perspective. I love listening to Jewish podcasts. Kvetching on the Couch is a podcast that has been extremely helpful for me to listen to because the two women who run it are both Jewish. They are licensed social workers and therapists who work specifically with mental health issues related to the Jewish identity. And they bring on only Jewish guests and talk about what's going on in the world right now. So that's been really helpful. And just celebrating Jewish joy. Like, we hear so often about the Jewish identity related to genocide and struggle and violence. I love watching videos of people making blue braided challah and how it comes out so beautifully. Hearing about new books that are coming out. Like, I can't help myself, I have to share one. This book just recently came out. It's called The Very Best Sukkah, A Story from Uganda. And the author is a rabbinical student in New York City who's also from Uganda. And she wrote about her favorite holiday of Sukkot and what that was like in her Ugandan community. So just like hearing little wins like that really help. And finding community. I participate in CJP Boston, Combined Jewish Philanthropies, and sometimes it's just nice to be with other Jewish people and make an action plan.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for sharing this. My second thing, I'd love to hear book recommendations for kids. My son is 5, my daughter's 11. We have a lot of open conversations about things that go on in the world now and things that have gone on in the past. And I feel like they have a fairly wide view of reality. So any books that, can contribute to that would be amazing.
Absolutely.
So I'm from England, and I grew up hearing so many stories from family members, and visited a lot of places in Germany, including concentration camps. And it's always just taken my breath away every time I hear these stories and what people had to experience. But I'm just so appreciative that people are willing to tell these stories and that they live on. The Shoah Foundation is fantastic. And just a way to make this continue to be real, and hopefully that people can learn from it and help so that it's not repeated in the future. So I really appreciate you sharing. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for your appreciations. I agree. I think as hard as it is to tell these stories, because it isn't easy. One of the things, so my grandmother used to go into schools and share this story. So I've always told myself that if she can relive that herself, then I can definitely tell it third person. And she always said that she shares your view as well. I want to tell these stories because our greatest fear is that these stories would be lost, especially as, this generation is really not here anymore. So it's up to their family members to continue to tell their stories. My grandmother did pass when I was in my mid-20s. So unfortunately, she's not here anymore, but we're very lucky. We also have the videotapes from the Shoah Foundation where she gave her interview. And one of my favorite memories with her younger sister, Marion, who lived until 2020, was my mom, my brother, and I and her sister Marion were watching her Shoah interview tapes together. And she's sitting in the chair, right against the TV, yelling at my grandmother, that's not how it went, and she's critiquing her interview the whole time. So I just think sharing these stories is so important, and also recognizing the humans that went through it. Because we hear about the stories a lot, but you don't really hear about the human beings and who they became and who they were before. So I thank you so much for sharing that. And I really appreciate how you also are raising your kids. Rochelle and I put together a list of resources that is going out to the district. I think it's also in the invitation from yesterday. And at the bottom, there's a resource called the PJ Library. It's an incredible place. The PJ Library is a Jewish-run library centering Jewish stories. So I would say any book on there, definitely order. I also have next to me, I heard 5. So Shabbat Princess is super cute. It's about a little girl celebrating Shabbat with her family. And it's just a really nice celebration of Jewish joy, especially since students don't really hear the joy of being Jewish in school so often. The first time they hear about the Jewish identity is usually related to the Holocaust. So I really appreciate you sharing those stories with your family before they make that association with violence. Another really great story is Jalapeno Bagels. It's a story about a young boy who has 2 identities of being both Latino but also Jewish, and he's trying to figure out what he wants to bring as a food item to the multicultural fair that really captures both of those things. Ada, who spoke earlier, and I read it together the other day, and it's just a really nice feel-good story of lots of vocabulary and language, both Yiddish and Spanish, like a celebration of who he is. And it's a really nice book to read as well that demystifies the Jewish diaspora, and that like not all Jews are white and speak English. So I love that book as well. And if you want more, just send me an email. I can get you a whole list.
Would you ever consider speaking at a local temple?
I would love that. Yes, I would definitely consider it.
Offline. Yeah, that's excellent.
Yes.
We'll reach out offline.
Please, I would love that. If you need my email, let me know.
I have it.
Good. Great.
Right. And Wendy.
I have the pleasure of working in the same school as Kim, and we have this little Jewish bond thing going on. And I just want to thank you for sharing this story, as hard as it is, because I'm going to kind of echo what Becky had mentioned, that we should, not repeat it. And it's important that it's heard. And I hope that many people watch the recording. It's fascinating. And I also have my own relatives that we have my great-grandfather on videotape, actual videotape, telling his story about how his family perished. And it's quite fascinating. It's so disturbing. And I thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for sharing your story with all of us.
Thank you, Wendy. It's really nice. Wendy and I do have a lot of really nice exchanges in the hallways. She's always the person that I run up to, like, we're talking about the Holocaust today. I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Hey, I do see a question in the chat that's Becky is asking if we're allowed to show the recording in our classes. She's asking for Fuller Middle School.
So, I mean, I can answer that. Dr. Tremlett, feel free, you can answer that. I personally feel like I came on this call knowing it was going to get recorded because I hope it gets shared with as many people as possible. I know Fuller Middle School has already started hearing some Holocaust stories. I heard that there was an assembly and some stories were shared. So I know that work has already started there. And I mean, again, like check with your building principal and everybody there. I'm always happy for my story to be shared, and I know that that is already work that's happening at Fuller. So if this is another resource for you to add, I share this story so that it continues to be shared elsewhere.
So,
sorry,
yeah,
I'm happy to.
yeah.
I'm happy to come. Sorry, I'm at Atlanta.
Sorry, I called you out. I know you're traveling.
That's okay. I just want to say thank you also, and amazing. I think that I'm a huge advocate of truth and getting this message out, and the historical. I just think the context is important, and especially some of the graphic nature of the story. I think that's just going to be something that I'd have to depend on a case by case as to the maturity of the audience. But otherwise, I think it's an important story to be told. And I appreciate you sharing it with us.
Thank you for tuning in. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you to everybody who asked questions and contributed and was willing to have discussion on this. And Kimmy, of course, for being available and amplifying this in so many ways. I think that at least for the things that you and I have done starting last year, like every year, there's an opportunity to grow and develop this further. I know one of the things we also talked about was the idea of connecting with Framingham Public Library, and maybe there's something that they would want to do around this time next year.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It seriously, from the bottom of my heart, means a lot that you showed up.